Cyber warfare has been called America's greatest threat by leaders in every major department of the U.S. government. Mike Rogers is our most recognized expert on this subject, bar none. He's a four-star admiral. He served as commander of the 10th Fleet and second commander of the United States Fleet Cyber Command, with responsibility for all of the Navy's cyber warfare efforts. He concurrently served as the 17th Director of the National Security Agency and as Chief of the Central Security Office during two different United States presidencies. Please welcome Admiral Mike Rogers.
Thank you. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And let me start out by apologizing. I did not do slides, and normally I would have, but quite frankly, I have just been inundated with Russia-Ukraine for the last 2 weeks, and I have just been head down, totally focused on that. So please accept my apologies. As you heard, I think part of my challenge in the next 20 minutes is we heard about the power of possibility this morning, and we heard about the strength of innovation and how some amazing people are doing things that are going to make our society better, improve the quality of our lives, the duration of our lives. And yet I'm going to spend some time talking to you about something that potentially places much of that at risk were it to get really, really bad. So I want to talk to you about cyber war. Now, the first comment I make is we need to kind of agree as to what the definition of cyber war is. There is no established definition that I could find. There was certainly none in the government when I was in, and the two presidents that I worked for directly on this subject, we would often go back and forth about, so Mike, what is it not? So let me read. This is how I define it. I define cyber war as the unauthorized penetration of a computer or a broader network by a nation state or for a nation state for the purposes of destroying, denying, disrupting, or degrading the connectivity or functionality of that computer, that network, or the data it contains. So there's a couple important points of that. Act of war. From a legal definition, that is a nation state. That is not necessarily criminal activity. So we'll talk a little bit about ransomware and how that has been. That's not really what I would define as cyber war. First, let me start with a little history, because one of the things I always try to remind people is, look, if you want to know where we are and where we're going, you should spend some time thinking about where we have been, because where we have been has in no small part shaped one of the reasons why we got multiple challenges today. So we first actually come up with the idea of an automated machine that ultimately we call a computer in 1936 by an individual named Alan Turing, who helped break the Enigma codes of the Nazis in the Second World War. We developed the first, if you will, computers, or at least electrical devices, in the 1950s. But remember, they are the size of rooms. They are so large, they are only in offices and buildings. Individuals don't have computer access at home. The next kind of milestone that I would highlight is 1969. The Department of Defense articulates a requirement for what ultimately becomes the internet. This connectivity, if you will, that we've created globally. It's important to remember what we did and what we did not do with that internet. We did not design security as a core design feature. Why? Because in 1969, when the Department of Defense initially came up with this requirement, the thought was, who would be interested in getting into an unclassified network with open information? Why would we need to worry about that? And so security was not built into it. In the 1980s, we get the first desktops. So computers now go from these really large, complex, I'm sure many of you, I am of the age, I wrote my computer programs in college on cards. You had to log time to get to the computer center. In the 1980s, we get the first desktops. In 1991, we create the World Wide Web. That's important because now we take the internet and we scan it to a global scale. And we come up with an address scheme that now enables us to literally bring on board tens of billions of entities, that enables the expansion that we've seen. In the 1990s, we get the first laptops. So now we've got computer mobility. We can actually take computers with us. In the 1990s, cell phone technology matures to the point where it's not a brick that we can only keep in a car, or we've actually got to put in a bag and carry with us. It's a small enough handheld device that it truly is mobile, and we carry it on our person. In the 2000s, we start to get smartphones. And what's important about that is our phones are now digital devices. They're not just the ability to call someone. They give us access to a broader global connectivity and a set of capabilities. And with that, we actually develop software apps. So now we've got functionality that we can access on the phones. We then, in the 2015 era, I would argue, we start to get into the age of hyperconnectivity. We literally are starting to connect all of these devices, all of this fixed infrastructure, all of this connectivity is now all tied together. That's important because the positive side is it gave us great increased functionality and speed. The flip side is it gives us massive vulnerability because now everything, simplistically, and combined with the Internet of Things, everything is tied together, everything is connected. It is really hard to, quote, isolate in the digital world, whether you want to do it as an individual, you want to do it as a company and an organization, or we try to do it as a government. I will tell you, for example, I have been asked in my previous professional life, Mike, could we isolate country X off the internet? Is that something that would be possible? Is that an option for us? And I would tell you that is, you can certainly have impact, but doing something totally is really challenging. The last technical piece I would highlight is 5G. We're in the midst of installing 5G mobile cellular capacity around the world. 5G takes a phone and turns it truly into this massive digital network. 5G technology will power things like autonomous vehicles. Because remember, autonomous vehicles need constant access to data, and you're remotely monitoring the vehicle. To do that, you got to have a network structure that is speed, connectivity, and can actually take the capacity of this. That is what 5G does. It is a total game changer from a technology standpoint. So we talked about systems. Let's talk about individuals real quick. In the 1980s now, it's the first time you really start to get what we call hacking. Anybody remember the 1983 movie War Games? What is it? It's a kid. In the 1980s, hacking is largely the acts of individuals. And it's generally about, well, let me show you what I can do. It's a way to show others what you're capable of. It's not viewed so much as, well, this is a weapon. It's a means for me to destroy, degrade, deny, like I said. In the 1990s, nation states start to discover the power of cyber as an espionage tool. Can we penetrate foreign networks and extract information? And again, being very honest and direct, that is what the National Security Agency does for our nation. We penetrate, among other things, foreign networks, and we find information that we believe significantly impacts the security and well-being of our nation and our friends and allies. And we extract it and we share the insights with our elected leadership, our military, and our friends and allies around the world. In the 2000s, you start to see nation states view cyber as both a weapon and an economic tool. According to media reporting, we have this thing called Stuxnet, where for the first time, you see a computer software program that is designed to physically destroy infrastructure in Iran associated with the development of nuclear weapons. At the same time, in the 2000s, you start to see, particularly China, view cyber as an economic tool. I can penetrate networks and I can extract and steal intellectual property that gives me economic advantage, saves me a fortune in research and development, and compresses my development timelines. So if I'm looking at doing deep sea oil exploration in the South China Sea, and if I can steal deep sea drilling oil technology, I've saved myself billions of dollars in a lot of years. Also, I would argue you saw in the 2010s, criminal groups really start to emerge. It's not that they weren't there before, but they come to a whole level. Criminal groups, why? They're focused on the revenue. They view cyber as a tool to extort, to generate money. So think about it now. We've got individuals who have been hacking. We've got nation states who view this as a way to potentially gain advantage. And now we've got criminal actors who view this as a way, I can really generate money on an unsurpassed scale. Depending on what standard you use in 2020, the last complete year of data I've seen, ransomware generated almost $3 trillion around the world. So the penetration of computers by criminal groups has become massive, massive business. And at the same time, in the 2000s, you saw nation states, literally almost every nation in the world is investing in cyber. So massive increases in capacity and capability. Everybody's raising their game. I mean, I constantly in my previous life always asked, who are the ones we should be concerned about? Who has the most capacity? I would argue our advantage here continues to erode. Everybody's knowledge just keeps going up. And then in 2022, the pandemic hits. And from a cyber perspective, it has a massive impact. Why? Because now we are all dispersed. We're away from the office. And even if we're using an office supplied computer, it is still using your home router, for example. And suddenly we have blurred the difference between what is work infrastructure and what is home infrastructure. And we're all suddenly using the same infrastructure for our children to game, for our children to go to school, for adults to do their jobs, to do work, for us to maintain contact with our families and friends around the world in the middle of a pandemic. We start to blur the lines between what is work and what is personal. And a lot of cyber actors are taking care of that. So let me focus then on where we are in 2022 and why I think what is going on in Russia and the Ukraine is going to be a watershed in cyber warfare. And why I would argue you're seeing some things unfold right now that are going to shape the future for us as individuals, for companies, for our governments, and for the broader world around us. So first, what are you seeing? Cyber has been a significant element of both the Russian and Ukrainian efforts, both to inflict pain on the other as well as to defend themselves. Both actors have turned to external groups. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have said, hey, look, we are going to create patriotic hacking groups. These are non-government, non-military, non-state security individuals who will come and will work with us to increase our cyber capacity and cyber capability. You're seeing criminal groups in Russia talk about how they are going to come on the side of Russia with respect to the application of cyber. You're seeing nation states, as I said, turn to surrogates. We talked about individual groups, but look at what industry is doing. You are watching industry, and I don't mean this as a criticism, this is just an observation. You are watching industry apply their capabilities to help these nation states in the middle of a war. It might be you're an Elon Musk and you want to ensure that Ukraine continues to have connectivity, because if the internet goes down, you want to use satellite access. So you're providing tools for them to do that. You look at, I could probably name 5 major companies off the top of my head in cybersecurity that are currently right now doing cybersecurity work with the Ukraine, and I know of about 3 major Russian cybersecurity firms right now that are doing cybersecurity work for the Russian government in the middle of the war. So you're just seeing a whole new ecosystem. All those trends that I talked about, that broader technology I talked about, it is all starting to come together now. The lines are really blurring. It's getting harder and harder to tell who the actors are, what's their objective, and what are they trying to achieve. I want to highlight 4 specific things, I think, because I'm mindful I don't want to go long. I want to highlight 4 specific things that I think are significant implications of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia with respect to cyber. The first, I believe for the first time in the coming weeks and months, you will see businesses, the private sector, will become targets in an economic war. Businesses historically were penetrated for cyber purposes, for intellectual property, as a target of espionage, particularly if they worked within the defense or security sectors or high technology sectors, or they were viewed as a ransomware target, a revenue generation opportunity. They were not generally viewed as a target in a broader war. I think that's changing. And so, literally, I was up at 02 this morning talking to a company in Eastern Europe, because it's the morning over there, about what are the implications for them, for a trans-global corporation, as they're trying to figure out what are the implications in all of this. So business as a target, if that's true, then it starts to ask questions in our society. So what is the role of the government then? Does that change the government's responsibility? Because right now we largely say cybersecurity is a personal or a corporate function. It is not something the government assists you, but the government is not responsible for it. The government doesn't create it. You, the private entity, you, the individual, are responsible. The second thing I would highlight is the initial targets I think that you're going to play out over the next few weeks, government, businesses, but there will be an individual component to this. Because the Russians in particular are looking at who is speaking out against them, who is donating money in support of potential adversaries for them, who are leaders within corporations that are pulling out their businesses from Russia. There will be an individual piece to all of this. I also believe in the next few weeks, you are going to see the Russians use cyber as a tool to create economic pressure in the West. Because remember, the Russians right now dealing with a series of global sanctions that the world has never seen before. If you're the Russians, you don't have a lot of tools available to cause similar economic pain in the United States and in these broader nations that are executing these sanctions. Cyber becomes an attractive tool. If I can degrade, destroy, deny, disrupt critical infrastructure, power, connectivity, financial, energy distribution, aviation, the things that we take for granted every day that enable us to live these incredibly complicated but incredibly productive lives, we need to be ready if they decide that they want to start disrupting that. And the fourth and final point I would make is we need to think about unintended consequences, because we have never seen cyber applied so broadly in a war as we are watching unfold in the Ukraine. And one of the things that worries me about all these surrogate groups, they are not so worried about second and third order effects. They want to cause as much pain as they can. The greatest cyber event, arguably, in terms of global impact and cost, is not Petya, June 2017. The Russians decide they want to use a supply chain attack to go after the infrastructure in the Ukraine, except the technique they use ends up proliferating the malware or malicious software programs that they write. And suddenly that malware is being found all over the world. So we've already seen a nation that, quite frankly, does not really concern itself so much about limits and secondary damage. All they seem to care about was, hey, did it have the impact in the Ukraine we wanted? If it had a global impact, oh, well, that's just another added benefit. But not Petya, depending on the source you want to use, costs the broader global community anywhere from $3 to $30 billion and disrupted global economic activity to some degree, much less in the United States, much more in Asia and Eastern Europe, for anywhere from weeks to months. Think about all these patriotic hacker groups that are out there. I worry, how much are you concerned about unintended consequence here? As an individual who used to do this for our nation, one of the things that was always, was pounded into me from our nation's leadership, and I always made sure the team understood, we want no unintended consequences. If we're going after a target in cyber, it only affects that target and it only has the specific effect we want. We don't want something that's going to get out of control. We don't want something that's going to proliferate. We don't want something that's going to have broader impact. I worry that many of these partners or players in this whole thing don't have that same sense of concern. That could very much be a challenge for us. Lastly, I want to talk to you really quickly about the idea of resilience. The reality is I spent 20 years as part of teams that both penetrated networks for a living and defended networks for a living. And I have managed to fail at times in both categories. On the defensive side, a couple times very publicly, where, for example, we acknowledged the Russians got into a portion of our unclassified Pentagon network. And the team that I was leading, we were responsible for driving them out. I always try to remind people, look, given this hyper-connected world in which we live in, given the probability that we will have activity that is not only directed specifically against us, but we may be the unintended victim, like that NotPetya scenario I talked about, we as a society must be resilient. Our standard cannot be there can't be any issues or impact in cyber. If that's the standard we apply, I guarantee you as a nation, we are about to be very frustrated. My attitude is, and what I always tried to tell our nation's leadership and the teams that I led, what we need to focus on is cyber resilience and our ability to recover and our ability to sustain activity in the face of these kinds of cyber events. It's about how quickly can we restore. It's about how quickly can we bypass or develop alternative capability. That takes time, that takes thought. And there's also an idea here of, our resilience as a society. We're not used to this idea of potential significant disruption. It's just not what we're used to. You saw a taste of this potentially with Colonial Pipeline. It's hard to believe that's almost a year ago. A ransomware attack against the single largest distributor of refined petroleum products, which addressed 45%. They were the source of 45% of the distribution of gasoline products between Houston, Texas, and the New York area. They took themselves offline because they had a ransomware event. That lasted about 7 days. And you had people going to gas stations and putting gasoline in plastic bags. Not only is that not a safe practice, it also isn't going to work, guys. You do know that gasoline eats through plastic. But in any event, I see things like that, and I think to myself, guys, as a society, we've got to be smarter. We've got to be more resilient here. We have learned how to deal with pain before in our history. I believe we can do it. And we've got to be ready for it. And with that, I thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you for being here today.
Could I ask you a couple of questions?
Sure.
That was a remarkable and highly sobering presentation, to state the obvious. I wonder if you have been surprised that so far the Russians have not used the cyber front in ways we have heard about, in the face of what I am sure both the Russian people and the Russian government think are highly cyber-oriented provocations by the United States and the West.
So it's funny you say very sobering. Literally, the two presidents I work for would always say, if Mike calls, it is generally a bad day. So if I went to them with something. I was surprised we didn't see it, but as I look back, here's why I think we have not seen as much. Number one, the Russians were they totally misjudged. I believe they thought, it is 72 to, it's 48 to 72 hours for us to get in. We're going to be very successful. The same infrastructure that we might potentially degrade or destroy through cyber, guess what? When we assume power in the Ukraine, we're going to need it to disseminate information to the populace. We're going to need it to coordinate. Hey, don't touch the infrastructure. Again, I think they thought we're going to get in there so quickly, we'll just use it. Secondly, I think their calculation was, we do not want this to broaden into a conflict bigger than the Ukraine. If we use cyber significantly outside of the Ukraine, because there is a lot of activity going on in the Ukraine. Some of it's not getting a lot of attention, but there's a lot of stuff going on. I think their calculus also was, there's a real downside in the beginning to using cyber more broadly in the United States and in the West. What changes, and why I tell you, look, I think in the coming weeks and months, that dynamic is going to change. I think Putin is now in Moscow, and he said, or Sochi, his villa down in the south, and he says to himself, this has gone worse than I thought it would. The economic pressure I'm dealing with is greater than I thought it would be. And the cohesion of the nations arrayed against me is much tighter than I thought it would be. Therefore, I need to ask myself, what tools do I have to cause economic pain to the West with the view that perhaps they'll back off? I need to cause political disunity so that the populations in those Western nations will go to their elected leadership and say, hey, I don't think it's a good thing that the Russians are invading the Ukraine, but I didn't sign up to $5 a gallon gas. I didn't sign up to disruption and other things. I believe that the Russians are going to be asking themselves, how do we create pressure?
So in light of what you just said, which is the idea that it is probable that these kinds of cyber incursions are going to proliferate, at what point does that then cross the line into being an act of war? What then is the response of the United States and the allied countries to that? And what form would it take?
So in two ways, one of the million-dollar questions. There is no accepted international definition, either legally or from a policy perspective, as to what an act of war is within the cyber arena. We have had cyber activity. Go back to Sony, 2014. The North Koreans launched 2 malicious Viper malwares that end up literally destroying the computer system of a private company, Sony Motion Picture Entertainment, because this company develops a movie that is a caricature of the beloved leader, Kim Jong-un, in North Korea. And they launch a cyber attack. And I mean, I was part in the sit room and in the Oval talking with this about President Obama about what does this mean? What are we going to do? We opted, the policy decision was, well, we're going to treat it as a legal issue, the theft of intellectual property, the breaking and entering, if you will. So there's no defined agreement. It is interesting. NATO has already publicly said prior to this event, and they've reiterated it, a significant cyber act against any NATO nation potentially trips the Article 5 mutual defense portion and may be identified by the alliance as an act of war in which the alliance will respond. Now, the alliance then also says the actual determination will be based on the specifics of the event, the specifics of the effect, the specifics of the target. So that's kind of where we are, the U.S., that's kind of our position.
So depending on the specifics of the event, the specifics of the target, and the effects,
right.
At what point does the response of the allied nations move from the cyber arena to the kinetic warfare arena, or does it?
That would have to be a really high threshold, because part of the challenge here, again, in my previous life, you always were concerned, and the nation's leadership was always concerned, you do not want to escalate this situation into a broader confrontation, whether it be in cyber or whether it be in a kinetic, shooting down planes and dropping bombs. You do not want to broaden this into a broader conflict between the United States and Russia. The stated goal of the alliance in our nation is we want to contain this to the Ukraine. We want to apply enough pressure that we convince Putin that he needs to back off and he needs to pull out. But we don't want to apply so much pressure that we destabilize the situation. And he believes, for example, his back is against the wall. I've heard a couple people in some of the things I do, he's got to go. And I'm sitting here thinking, so you're advocating regime change? Do you know what the implications of regime change as a stated policy objective are? That totally changes this dynamic. If Putin thinks the goal is to drive him out of power, how do you think his risk threshold starts to look? He will really go to the wall. So I always encourage people, look, guys, we need to put enough pressure to get him to change his calculus, but we do not want to put so much pressure on this that he truly starts to believe that he's got no options and his back is against the wall. He's already rattled the nuclear saber to us. You don't want him going beyond that. And you don't want him getting into things like, I'm going to do destructive cyber against the power grids around the world, or I'm going to try to take out the financial networks around the world.
The more cornered and the more threatened he feels, the more destable.
Right, that's my opinion. I'm just giving you my opinion.
Final question. Do we know where Putin is?
We have I won't go into the specifics, but generally, for the variety of means, we have a fairly consistent idea of.
I'll take that just the way you mumbled it.
There you go.
Mike Rogers, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks very much. Thanks.